I'm Colleen with the Tampa Hillsborough County Public Library System, and welcome to Written By with author Doris Weatherford. Doris Weatherford has been publishing books on women's history for over 30 years. Her first was Foreign and Female, Immigrant Women in America, 1840 to 1930. Published in 1986, it was revised and expanded in 1995. Perkis Review said of it, absorbing chapters full of quotations from original letters and diaries, meticulous research, vibrant reading. Library Journal called it fascinating and immensely readable. General readers will enjoy and will be amazed. Her other books include American Women's History in A to Z and Milestones, a chronology of American women's history, among many others, which cover history from the local to the national. We're excited to have Doris here as part of Women's History Month. You can find more information about the other programs that we are doing this month at the library by visiting the Women's History Month library landing page, which you can see on your screen, hcplc.org/Women's History Month. Tonight, we're shouting out Doris's book, Real Women of Hillsborough County from Prehistory to the Millennium, which explores the critical role women have played throughout Hillsborough County's history. Now I'm going to hand things over to Doris Weatherford for her presentation.
Hi, hello everybody. As Colleen said, I wrote my first book in 1986 on immigration. I've since then written 2 books on World War II, women in World War II. And my most recent book actually is on current women's issues. It's called Victory for the Vote. It came out for the anniversary of the 19th Amendment that assured the right to vote to all women. And it has an introduction by Nancy Pelosi. So you can find these and other things online. If you just Google my name, my Authors Guild website will come up and you'll find a lot of books. But tonight I want to concentrate on the real women of Hillsborough County, and I'm holding up the first edition of this book, which was published in 2004, sponsored by the Athena Society, and I want to give a shout out to the Athena Society. All money from the sale of this book goes to the Athena Society. I'm not making any money off of it. And Athena uses it for scholarships for women and career assistance for women. The one that you saw, it sold out in this version, and then the one that you saw was republished a decade or so later. But the content is the same, except the later one has an additional chapter on more recent activity. So people often ask me who decided who gets in this women's history book. And so I want to start at the beginning saying, this is not a collection of biographies. This is a history of the Tampa Bay area that highlights the roles of women. It is not at all a collection of biographies. And you need to be aware of that before you dive in. So the first chapter starts with our earliest possible times, prehistory. You all are probably aware of the 𝘗𝘰𝘮𝘬 restaurant. 𝘗𝘰𝘮𝘬 was a real woman, and she was a member of the native tribes here. She saved a Spanish explorer from being burned to death, and he rewarded her by continuing to attack her tribe the next time the Spanish came in again. There were women with every Spanish invasion. There were 6 Spanish invasions from 1513 to 1565, when St. Augustine was permanently settled. And if you want to know more about places other than Tampa, this is the book you should read. They Dared to Dream, Women Who Shaped Florida History. And again, it's not biographies, it is a collection, it is a history of Florida that highlights its women. So, and this is available from the University Press of Florida. You can go online and order it. Anyway, here in Tampa, the most interesting of these early women was a woman called Magdalena, who somehow probably was kidnapped, or maybe voluntarily went from Tampa Bay to Mexico. And a priest who wanted to convert the natives here recruited her to bring him to Tampa Bay, which she did. This was in the 1550s. I've forgotten the exact date. And as soon as the priest, Father Louis Castor, got off the ship, they shot him with arrows. And so it's never, we don't know if Magdalena betrayed Father Louis or if she didn't understand what was going on and how hostile the natives were. But she did stay here and rejoined her tribe, so she probably did deliberately betray him. Anyway, there are a lot of interesting women in prehistory. Women played strong roles in native tribes that have been largely forgotten. The Spanish settled St. Augustine, as I said, in 1565, and not much later than that, we had successful settlement at Pensacola. So there were two Spanish settlements 400 miles apart in West Florida and East Florida. And they were governed separately. The Spanish Empire was effectively down to Gainesville. After that, they didn't really try to settle much, but there were big ranches, women owned big property. And again, you can read more about this. Florida acquired Spain from we acquired it from Spain and began serious settlement in 1824. Fort Brooke was built at Tampa. The capital was established in Tallahassee at the same time, 1824. And the first colonial governor was Andrew Jackson. And his wife, Rachel Jackson, came down and was First Lady of Florida briefly. She left some very interesting records about it, as did other women of that era. And again, I don't have time to talk much about this, but it's interesting. A second woman, the second governor, was John Eaton, and his wife, Peggy Eaton, also was a nationally known figure and controversial. She, you may have heard of the Petticoat Wars in Washington during Jackson's administration, and she was at the center of that. That chapter is titled The Beginnings, 1824 to 1858. And the reason for 1858 is that we had the third war against the Seminoles. There had been one in 1816, again in the 1830s, and in 1858, we finally, I shouldn't say we, but the U.S. Army, pushed out the Seminoles completely, deported many to Oklahoma Territory on a ship, forced the rest down into the Everglades, tried to hunt them down, but were unsuccessful. And in 1858, they called it off because the Civil War was looming. The Civil War was very difficult for Florida women. Probably our most important woman was a Jacksonville woman whose wife had been governor, and whose husband had been governor, and she established a hospital for Floridians in Richmond. There were many organizations that raised money for the Confederate Army. There were some Unionists, especially in Key West, but in Tampa was invaded 3 times by Union troops because our harbor was significant. At the same time, the town was so small and it was really not worth keeping. So they invaded, struck down the ships that were running the blockade, burned them, and took off again, and then had to do another invasion later on. And meanwhile, of course, women really suffered. Women were running farms and businesses by themselves with their men gone. The Union troops who occupied were not particularly kind to women, and the Civil War was very difficult. Florida suffered less than other states, but we were. I should point out a solidly Confederate state, the last one, the third one to secede, and the last to not formally secede, but the last to lose its capital. This Reconstruction, Black men got some rights. Black men were elected to office in Tampa. Black women began to organize to create schools for their people. The first movements for women's civil rights were in that era, although they didn't really last. And then in 1876, when the federal government pulled out the troops, things went back to how they had been in plantation days. But it is important to know that a number of Black women were big landowners. They took advantage of the rights that the federal government gave them after the Civil War. And a woman named Gloria Royster has done a wonderful job of talking about Fortune Taylor. You may know Fortune Street downtown. It is named for her, and there were other women who owned big sections of property downtown that was more or less taken from them. They were exploited. They in the late 19th century was a definite time of going backwards for Black people. And then another war. War is what matters most of all, unfortunately. The Spanish-American War, 1898, when Cuba did its final successful revolution against Spain, and Spain lost the last of the colonies it had had in the New World. One of the leaders of that was a woman named Paulina Pedroso, who was a close friend of Jose Marti. And I was the only woman on the committee that selected the statues for the Riverwalk. And one of the first ones we did was Paulina Pedroso. She also is in the Florida Women's Hall of Fame. The Spanish-American War really changed things. Clara Barton was here. Teddy Roosevelt gets all the attention, but Clara Barton was here too. It's a good example of how women are just in the footnotes, not bothered. But the Spanish-American War changed things. The railroad had come in by then. The railroad came in the 1820s with Henry Plant. He and his wife, Margaret Plant, built this fantastic hotel that brought Yankees down for the winter. And the cigar industry moved here. And that was the biggest thing. The Cuban women, the women from Key West who worked in the cigar industry, were probably the most liberated of any at their time. They worked flexible hours. They were skilled. They earned their wages on the basis of their productivity, not on their time. So women could earn as much or more than men. Ybor City developed, as you probably know, centered around the cigar industry. And the book pays a lot of attention to the various strikes and labor issues that women were deeply involved in. So we've now turned the century. One of the most interesting things that happened that very few people know about was in 1916, when a woman named Alice Snow, S-N-O-W, filed to run for the school board. She realized that there wasn't any legal impediment to running for the school board, and she did. There's a little tiny fountain down at the intersection of Kennedy and Grand Central that is called Snow Park, and that is named for her and her husband. She, the guys didn't know what to do with this woman who ran for office. They said, well, if you get a petition with 25 signatures within a couple of hours, we'll put you on the ballot. And she did. And she probably won the election because it took them 3 days to count the ballots, and there weren't that many to count. She lost, so to speak. Tampa politics was very, very corrupt. Up until the 1970s, it was corrupt. And but her motivation in running was that the women's clubs, there were several clubs that belonged to the National General Federation of Women's Clubs, and they worked on playgrounds for kids. Kate Jackson was a leader in that, and you probably know of Kate Jackson Recreation Center. We also have a Riverwalk statue for her. The first hospital already had been established by women after the terrible epidemic in the 1880s that killed 10% of the population, and a woman turned her home into a hospital, and that was the origin of Tampa General, and women ran it until the doctors decided that they didn't want that. Hospitals, schools, playgrounds, sanitation. Kate Jackson and her clubs, again, worked very hard to establish a sewer system, pure water. These epidemics were caused by the fact that people threw dead animals into the river. Just tremendous disregard for public health compared to now. And it was women who made those changes through the General Federation of Women's Clubs nationally, the Pure Food and Drug Act, and so forth. Okay, then we get up to the Great Depression, which was hard. There were programs for women, but they lost a lot of the progress we'd made. And then comes World War II, and again, new job opportunities. Women worked in shipyards. Tampa's biggest employer was 3 shipyards, and a lot of women came here for that. Tampa had 3 airfields, MacDill, Drew Park, where the airport is now, and Henderson Field, where USF is now. And so tens of thousands of guys came here, and that had an influence, a social influence that you can read more about. I titled the next chapter, The Beginnings of Permanent Change for Women, 1960 to 1980. There were women who have been almost entirely forgotten who ran for office then. But the first one to win was Cecile Esrig on the school board in 1967. And I'm going to tell you a little story here about Cecile that I didn't know until she died, and her daughters told me that when she decided she wanted to run for the school board, integration was a big issue. Florida was very, very slow to integrate, racially slow to integrate. And that was why Cecile ran. And she announced, and one of her neighbors came over and congratulated her and gave her a check, and then said, but I'm not going to vote for you. I don't vote for women. It's really appalling now, but this was in our lifetimes, my lifetime certainly. Betty Castor was the first woman elected to the county commission in 1972. This year will be the 50th anniversary of that. It's amazing to me that so much time has passed. But Betty, too, was a pioneer for women's rights. She was kicked out of the university club when they had a meeting there that should have been in a public place and not in a private place, but that was the way guys ran that things. And women couldn't be in the university club at lunchtime, so she was kicked out. And that was an awakening issue for people. In 1974, Fran Davin, who had managed Betty's campaign in 72, Fran was elected to the county commission. And a few years later, Jan Platt. And then a few years after that, 3 of the 5 guys went to prison for corruption. At the legislative level, Helen Gordon Davis was elected in 1974, the first woman from Hillsborough County. I managed her campaign in 1978 when she had a tough reelection. Helen made a lot of important changes in the legislature and went on to the Senate. And we began to elect women as judges. Now it has gotten to the point where women are more likely to be elected as judges than men. First woman on city council, by the way, was 𝘞𝘰𝘮𝘯𝘭𝘏, who died not too long ago. Robin Kravanek, I believe, as supervisor of elections, was the first woman elected to a county constitutional office. And we have made tremendous progress on all of those things. So I see that I've already used up my 20 minutes, and I'll entertain questions.
All right, thank you so much for that, Doris. Let's take a couple minutes to go over some questions. So let's take a look here. So we'll start with a broad one, and then maybe we'll move to some more specific ones. So how did you become interested in writing about history?
Very specific thing. I was teaching high school in Massachusetts while my husband was getting his PhD at Harvard. I had dropped out of graduate school. This was in the late 60s when women did that. So I was teaching high school, and I could get a raise if I took one more graduate level course. So I took a course in immigration at Harvard, summer course. And obviously the guy who was teaching it was a world expert on immigration. And he made the statement one day that men were more likely to adjust to America. Women were less likely to learn English, get lonesome, want to go back to Europe, blah, blah. So I, being young and in politics, raised my hand and said, what about my Norwegian and German grandmothers who got jobs in American homes? Wouldn't they learn from the inside what Americans ate, what they wore, how they lived? And he looked at me like the thought had never crossed his mind. And so I went over to the Widener Library, second biggest library in the world, next to the Library of Congress, to check out a single book on immigrant women. And there wasn't one. There were books on immigrants, there were books on women, and I read hundreds, or at least perused hundreds, and also did archival research and so forth to write Foreign and Female. And it was well received, and since then I never had any trouble. My second book, American Women in World War II, grew out of a similar thing. I was still in Massachusetts. I joined NOW in its early days, and a whack and a way got into an argument about which was the superior organization for women in the military in World War II. Well, we younger women had no idea what whacks or waves were, didn't know that women had participated in any meaningful way. Another older woman who was there talked about how she had worked in shipyards in Massachusetts during the war and how they had had 24-hour childcare at the shipyard where she worked. So that got me interested in World War II, and that became my second book.
Wow, it's a really fascinating story.
Mm-hmm. After that, I did mostly what editors wanted.
All right, let's see what else we have here. All right, so you've talked a little bit in your presentation about some of your public service work. So for example, the statues around Tampa. And so how has that public service work informed what you write about?
Yes. I could do a speech on just the Riverwalk statue. We operated for 6 years, put up 36 statues, and I managed to get 2 women every year except the last one when I only got 1. But in addition to Paulina Pedroso and Kate Jackson, just off the top of my head, Bina Moss, older people will remember Moss Brothers department stores. Bina Moss was the founder of the children's home, which still exists, an orphanage, and was Jewish. Paulina Pedroso, of course, was Hispanic. Oh, I didn't talk about Eleanor Chamberlain. You got the second statue. She was the leader of the suffrage movement in the 1890s and on into the 20th century. She once the 19th Amendment was adopted, she turned to doing good works and lobbied in the legislature for what were called mothers' pensions, which was a precursor of Social Security. Never was adopted, but the idea was that widows with young children should be entitled to some money. We have Blanche Arnold, who was a nationally known figure, the first Black person to be superintendent of Black schools in Hillsborough County, and an employee of the Urban League, nationally made major, actually she was the person who got Congress to pass what was called the Federal Household Arts Act, which was a subsidy for early home economics when we were changing from wood burning stoves to electric stoves. And there was a lot to be learned. And so companies like 𝘬𝘮 took this federal household arts training course at money and trained their domestic servants for this. Mentioning 𝘬𝘮 reminds me that the 𝘬𝘮 was originally established not so much for electricity, but to run the streetcars. And the woman who owned it was Emiliachapin, not a native, came here for a while, lived on the Bay Shore, was very wealthy, but she was the first person to establish 𝘬𝘮. So there are just lots of people like this, lots of them.
Well, it's super interesting. I can't wait to walk around Tampa now and see things through a different lens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, Clara Fry, she's got her statue. She, on her own, established the first hospital for Black people, and in her home, and later expanded. She was credentialed, she provided good service, so she has a statue, and the doctor who promoted her, a white man, also has a statue.
All right, it looks like we have time for about one more question. And so we got one in sort of about your thoughts on women's roles in politics more generally, both in Tampa and on the national level, which might be a good way to end Women's History Month discussion with you.
Good. I always say that it is a mountain chain, peaks and valleys. I think we've been going through a valley for a long time now, and I am very disappointed at the number of anti-feminist women who are being elected to office who do not share our goals of equality. Next year will be the centennial of the filing of the Equal Rights Amendment. It was first filed in 1923. And we have won most of its major objectives, but the fact that a century passed without it being adopted, and then the presidency also, I think the original suffragists would be very disappointed in us. There are dozens of nations that have elected women to their top office, and we have not. I think there is a lot to be done, and I'd like to see the energy of the 1970s again.
All right, well, thank you so much for your time. So really quick, I'm just going to share my screen again. All right, there it is. Okay, so to learn more about Women's History Month at the library, please remember to visit our landing page. We have obviously our lovely event with Doris tonight, but we have more on the way, both virtually and in person. And so finally, thank you so much for your time, Doris. This was a fascinating talk, and we can't wait to learn more about Tampa through reading your books. Everyone enjoy your evening.
Thank you. Let me add, I'm glad to get emails. Doris@𝘞𝘰𝘮𝘬𝘓.com. Lowercase, no punctuation between Doris, between D and Weatherford. So Doris@𝘞𝘰𝘮𝘬𝘓.com. And I love to hear from people, love to exchange ideas. Thank you.
Wonderful. Everyone have a good night.
Okay. Bye-bye.